Hey there, welcome to the Intentional Optimist Unconventional Leaders guest speaker series. I'm Andrea Johnson, the Intentional Optimist, and I am thrilled to have with me today a fabulous, amazing Maxwell Leadership Certified Speaker Trainer Coach and author, Sylvia Worsham. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for having me on this morning. I'm excited to
Good,
talk
me
to you.
too. Because if you listeners have not actually heard the podcast from this week, it's episode 88, and Sylvia is my guest. And her story is so compelling. It
I
just is.
appreciate that. It's a story that was in me for a long time. I just didn't write it for many, many years. And we'll go over why I didn't do
Yeah,
that shortly. But
yeah. Well, and on the podcast, what I do there is I pull out a little bit of your story, well, a lot of it.
hey,
Your story's got some doozy turning points in it. But I pull out your story and then we talk about a little bit of leadership. But what I love to do is bring my guests back out here. And this particular forum is for you to teach us. And you are an author of the book, The Journey to Me.
mhm.
And it's called Trust the Wisdom of Change. And when you go listen to your story or check out the blog post, either way, that has your information in it, but the podcast has all of the story. Um, you will see that this makes all the sense in the world that she would write a book called The Journey to Change, because your journey from overachiever, all your worth was based in achievement and performing to who you are now is that's a whole lot of change. Very
Oh,
different.
very, very, very different. In fact, people that have known me for many years are shocked. I would even have left that life to become the author I am today because it was so out of character for me to not
Mm,
achieve, to feel that worth. I was never motivated by money, even in sales. You know how people they say salespeople are always motivated by the money they can make, and for me,
sure.
it was like, no, the motivation was to gain significance from others.
Mm.
I got the significance, man, I worked and worked and worked and achieved for them
Yeah, I
every day,
mean,
all day.
if you need the significance of achievement, you're gonna get all the awards. You're probably gonna make the money because you're gonna have to be the highest earner and all that kind of thing. So as we today, we will only, spend a little over 30 minutes to a little over
Sure.
30 minutes. Kind of, I invited you on here to kind of walk us through a little mini master class of what it's like to walk through this book, The Journey to Me. And the nice thing is at the end of, and I do have a copy. She was kind enough to send me an autographed copy. So it is on my reading list. I was already in the middle of a couple of books. So I'm a reader. So this is going to work out well. But what I like about it too is that at the end of every chapter, this is just a tip, that there's not only coaching tips and traps, but there's a spiritual side to it. There's scripture, meditation, and prayer. There's questions for reflection and journaling. This is not a book that you just read and put on the shelf. This is a workbook.
Mhm. Very much so. In fact, a lot of people were asking me, "When is the workbook gonna come out?" And it was such a brilliant idea. I was like, "Yes, I need to work on the workbook," because a lot of people, what they wanted to do with the book, they couldn't put the book down because of the stories in it. They could relate
Mhm.
to the stories. And then they said, "Then I'm gonna go back and work on
Yeah.
the tips," because it I did it in that format in case you were navigating through similar turning points. I coached myself through it as if I had been coached at the time, I would have gained that joyful perspective much sooner.
Yeah.
And I got stuck in these self-sabotaging patterns of behavior that I discuss in the book. I discuss 7 of them in the book, but for the purposes of today, we're probably just gonna touch on 2 of them, that are in the first 4 chapters of it, but there's so much information in the book, it really merits a workbook.
Yeah. Well, so when you do that, will you just make this book a little bit smaller and then have a companion workbook with it, or will you leave everything in here?
Actually, I'm working on a second edition of this book because, as authors, we go through the first run
Mm,
of the book, and then as we read it and we start to transform ourselves and grow, our perspective changes and
sure.
we're able to write from a different perspective. This book was written from the pain perspective
Mm,
as I was journeying through to chapter 15. It's 15 chapters And at the end, I kind of journey to my empowered self, to my soul
Yeah.
identity.
Mm.
And when you get to chapter 4, which we will touch on briefly today, I will explain some of these cycles of transformation that occur when you face a turning point.
Okay.
So it's an interesting book in that regard, especially because we're all navigating through major change right now, post pandemic time. So
Mm.
it's
Understatement of the year.
oh, I
Yeah.
know, right?
Well, let's go ahead and pop into the book, and you're going to walk us through like the first four chapters, kind
Yes.
of a nice high level overview. So why don't I just kind of turn it over to you? I'm just going to ask questions because I'm curious. That's what I do.
Course, of
So
course.
school me.
Yeah, of course. Let's dive into chapter 1. Chapter 1, actually for those that shop on Amazon, you can see the full chapter 1 when you look inside the book. So it'll give you a very big view as to how the book is designed. Chapter 1, I take you to the significant emotional event of my life. The very first one that I could remember, a big trauma that happened when I was 7 years old. And not to ruin it for everybody, but when we have trauma, there we feel a feeling, and that feeling is key because that feeling, our mind, our subconscious mind, which is the most powerful part of the two minds, we have the subconscious and the conscious minds. It's the one that kind of rules our lives until we become aware of how to work with it. But for the time being, when you're little kids, you don't understand how this mind works. And so the mind has no filter. That subconscious part of the mind has no filter. So when you have major trauma, like I did, I couldn't understand why I was so mad at my dad for 30 years, why I carried so much anger and resentment. And when I reflected and wrote chapter 1, everything, there was like huge aha moments
Mm.
of like, wow, that makes sense,
Yeah.
So when the trauma occurs, the gist of it is my sister, there's an accident my sister is involved in, and my father, in his fear, gets angry and turns to me and says, if your sister dies, it will be your fault. It's major, major trauma, right? For a little kid to
Yeah.
feel. And so that is what we call a significant emotional event in our lives,
Sure.
right? And at the moment of trauma, my feeling of unworthiness and I don't trust myself, right, to make the right decisions is the limiting belief that gets formed. So I know the first point we have on there is a formula, and it's a formula I put in the book specifically to help guide you guys to understand how these limiting beliefs get formed. Because as coaches, you and I, Andrea, we understand how limiting beliefs kind of are the drivers of
Mm.
why we react to certain triggers, why we create certain habits in our life, why certain patterns of behavior develop. But for someone that doesn't understand the coaching process, the limiting belief is you really need to understand how it works in your mind, and why you need to identify them and uproot them and change them to a belief that's not based out of fear,
Mm.
but rather based out of love, right? And
Well,
so I
and
don't know if you wanted to ask a
I'm
question
going
there.
to jump in.
Sure.
I'm maybe halfway through the book, The Body Keeps the Score,
Okay.
and talking about trauma and the neurophysiological aspects of it. So I'm sitting here reading all or hearing all of this with new ears and reading with new eyes, because when you talk about trauma plus feelings, and you go into a little bit of the subconscious in your mind and that kind of thing, but a lot of times we don't actually have control over what happens to us. And so the feeling that comes of helplessness and loss of power
Mhm.
and shame or blame or whatever, our bodies can react in many different ways. Some people shut down. Some people, if you're able to get away, then it's a different response. But being able to look back and say, oh, that thing I went through, plus the
Mhm.
feelings that I felt in the moment,
Mhm.
create for me certain beliefs that I have that keep me from doing anything new or keep me from doing certain things. I have a friend who just for some reason, when she goes to Bed Bath and Beyond, they don't take any expired coupons from her, or she doesn't think. And I literally walk in with a stack this big, and it's like, how many can I use today? And I just flop them out there. And she's standing next to me. She's like, "I
Ah,
threw all mine away." And I'm like, "Never throw them away. You can't
uh-huh.
use them online." But it's this limiting belief that she has. I don't know where it came from, and it keeps her from saving all kinds of money, let me tell you.
Oh, yeah,
And
and
that's just
it's funny
minor.
that you mentioned money because this limiting belief that formed from this trauma was actually directly tied to the way I operated in finances in my life.
Oh.
Because at the time that this happens, okay, so I was blamed for it because I was the one that had insisted to go up the summit to go see snow. And so my father, in his mind, thought, I have someone to blame
Oh,
for
sure.
this, right? And so I'm going to blame my 7-year-old for my 2-year-old's accident.
Mhm.
Obviously, my sister survives the accident physically, emotionally, mentally, and I don't. I don't survive it
Mm.
mentally or emotionally because it really brings me down. So when the feeling of untrustworthiness comes in anywhere in my life, this limiting belief of I'm not able to trust myself to make the right decisions,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Now it years, and I'm talking about like 40 years later, there's a fight between my second husband and I, and he says, "People that don't trust others secretly don't trust themselves."
Oh.
And I thought, "Huh, click." And I was thinking about why don't I trust this dude with my money, you know? And it was because of this trauma. And you never
Yeah.
would suspect it, but the feeling is key, guys. So if anything you want to gain from chapter 1 is when you have big feelings show up in your life, start asking yourself, where is this coming from really? Like, what could have possibly caused this feeling? Like, where's your first initial instance that this feeling showed up in your life? And this is where the law of reflection that we talked about in your blog post and we talked about the first time you and I spoke
Right.
comes into big play.
That's
You
a big
only,
part of my business is reflection, and that's gonna be on
oh,
next week's
yes.
podcast.
And so it's a big one for us
Yeah.
because we go back, we time travel for perspective only, guys. We don't want to dive in there and stay there because then we live in that past programming. When we talk about past programming as coaches, the past programming is your habits and your limiting beliefs and your focus, and all of that is your programming.
Yeah.
It's what you allow into your life, the people that you allow to speak into your life that influence you. This will be critical in chapter 4 when we get there. It's very important, guys. So, from chapter 1, really, you want to focus in on the feeling because the feeling is central
Yeah.
to how your subconscious programming works, either for or against you. Depends on if it's based out of fear or if it's based out of love.
All
So,
right,
that's
well, let's go ahead and move into chapter 2 because this
sure.
seems like a logical progression of once you understand you're responsible and you understand what these limiting beliefs are, where'd you find the courage?
I found the courage. This is chapter 2 goes into bullying. And I remember from our first initial
Yeah.
conversation, you asked me what was my first leadership example that I could think of as a child.
Yeah.
And bullying it came out of chapter 2. In chapter 2, I dive very deeply into patterns of behavior. I start
Okay.
talking more about the victim, which is one of 7 patterns of behavior that I identify in the book. And every coach has different names for these things, but they essentially are all the same. Patterns of behavior form at the moment of trauma
Mhm.
and get attached to a feeling. And that's why it's so important to understand what that feeling is, because when that
Sure.
feeling shows up, then a certain pattern of behavior shows up. So let's talk about the victim a little bit. Victim is someone who blames others for their circumstances.
Mm.
They fail to take ownership for their role in situation. It's alive and well in our society.
Mm.
Very alive and well.
Oh,
So
yes, it is.
so why I titled it I Am Courageous is because every single chapter and journey to me teaches me a lesson. A turning point teaches us lessons in life.
Okay.
And that's why they can be so life altering for us because as we reflect on our life, we see how that lesson we learned in courage. So
Mhm.
when I faced my bullies in chapter 2, where a boy asked me to a homecoming dance and then he kind of pulls out of there. And And then my mom asked me, "Well, you can be either their victim, your bully's victim, or you can go to that dance, have the time of your life, and, wear your pretty dress. So either way," she says, "I will love you."
Yeah.
So I find the courage within myself and I tell myself, I don't want to be their victim. So in
Mm,
chapter 2, I kind of guide parents on what they can do if their children are being bullied
mm,
and how they can start turning that self assurance around for them. Because, as young adults, we have a confidence issue, don't we?
mhm,
And especially when we're getting bullied, your confidence tends to be lower. So I introduce the benefit of doing daily affirmations in
mm,
there.
mhm.
It's something I talk to my little girl about, and she's 7. So she's been doing it since the moment she could speak,
Oh, smart.
right? So
Yeah.
that's chapter 2.
So,
It's
one of the things that we did mention is that there's some self-sabotaging patterns that
sure.
you were is that part of the victim mentality?
The victim mentality is one of the 7. Is
Okay.
one of the 7. In chapter 1, I kind of briefly go over the security seeker, which forms at the moment of that initial trauma because I lose control of a situation, or I think
Mm,
I do, right? I'm 7 years old and it was my responsibility. That's why I'm responsible. I learned
mhm.
the
Yeah.
value of responsibility. Uh, I now want to control, my circumstances because I lost control and I
Okay.
shouldn't have, right? So security seeker gets introduced very briefly, but victim, we really dive into victim mentality and the characteristics because there's more than just the two that I just
Sure.
discussed, right?
Okay. So, this will give us an opportunity to kind of look at what are self-sabotaging. We all have them. Right.
All of us.
If you don't, then that's your self-sabotaging behavior is that you think you don't have any. So I think this is what you're telling me is this is a good opportunity to kind of look through and see what those might be and kind of look at the root for them.
Yes.
Okay.
Like what feeling is it attached to? Because when that feeling shows up, guys, that pattern of behavior is going to go on automatic.
Mm,
You're going to
that's
react a very
it is.
particular way,
It's like
right?
Pavlov, right? It's like bing.
Ding, and sometimes we form habits around
Yes.
these like your friend. She just threw them away. That was her
I
habit.
know.
She
I'm
just
like,
threw them
why'd you
away
do
because it's
that?
like, well, it doesn't work for me, right? And you don't even think about it. It's an automatic response because we know the subconscious mind works automatically
Yeah. And
based
it's
on
like,
what we feed it.
evidently they don't like me. And I'm like, they don't know you. This is not personal.
It's not a personal thing. I mean, shoot, my post yesterday on all my social media sites dealt with the victim
Mm.
pattern of behavior. And it's the source of a lot of family drama, guys. So if you have a
Oh
lot of
yeah.
family drama, look for victim to be really at the root of it and get out of there as
Yeah.
soon as possible. It's
Eject,
not a good
eject.
one.
Well,
Yeah.
and I think there's ways that we can do that in a constructive way that doesn't destroy our family, but it's smart for us to be able to even figure out ways to just put up shields, right? We joke
Oh
about
yeah.
shields up,
Yeah.
you know,
Shields up.
and
Well, but the
and they're
shield up keeps
clear.
us there, right?
Yeah, and sometimes they don't need to know my shields are up, but sometimes my shields are up, and I'm like, I don't need to worry about this. I'm safe. I don't have to worry about this. Okay, so that's chapter 2.
That's chapter 2.
All right, chapter 3.
Chapter 3, I take you into my college years, and this is where intuition really starts to get developed because you're in those formative years where you leave your home, right? And you leave your parents and your safe space, and now you're on your own.
Mm,
And I inadvertently, because I had very low self-esteem and I didn't believe myself to be beautiful enough, that limiting belief that formed in chapter 2 from the bullying years, and now is in full display in chapter 3. And I attract a certain individual into my life and I get engaged to this guy and chapter 3 really resonates with a lot of women that have read the book because we've all either dated or known a cheater, a serial cheater. And it's
mm,
not something that enhances our confidence. It actually brings it down. So this is where intuition can really help us because you talk about green flags. I talked about
mhm.
red flags in
Sure.
chapter 3 of like, watch these red flags
Yeah.
and they will show up in your life. And because if you're operating from a fear based space, you're going to fall into these traps. And you gotta be real careful. So this is where you really need to start turning inward for your answers and understanding these gut instincts that you
Mhm,
get along the way, or the red flags, right? In my book, I refer to them as God instincts
mhm.
Because I'm a believer of God, I'm very
Mhm.
faith-based, as most people know, and this book touches a lot on your faith. So, God, higher source, turn
Yeah.
inward for those answers and understand that the answers are always inside of you. It's
Well,
nothing is outside of you, really. You don't learn that till much, much later in life, but if you can learn that in your college years, you'll be good to go.
well, we're taught in our educational systems to find the answers in a book. We're taught in our spiritual systems to find the answers outside of ourselves as well. And there's a certain amount of that where we have to input information that's all 100% valid. But
Mhm.
the reality is, on top of that, we as a society, I'm just going to go off here just for a
Yes.
second. As a society, and maybe probably all of, actually not just our own, but we've gaslit women into believing, especially women, like you said,
Mhm.
every woman identifies with this thing. We've gaslit women into thinking that we don't have the power to actually make those choices for ourselves. And this is something that when you finally see those things, you can't
Mhm.
unsee them.
Mhm.
And if you want me to come out of my seat, get after like a goose chasing you away from whatever they don't want you near, it's that's if you're gonna when you touch on those kinds of things, then that's when I'm gonna really stand up and talk about empowerment. But being able to trust your own intuition, being able to
Yes.
trust the own inner voice, and for those of in a spiritual practice, mine as well as Christianity, and being able to trust that what the voice that I hear from God is actually a good voice, and I
Yes.
don't need to always ask somebody else. My personality is such. I'm an Enneagram 6, so my personality is such that I kind of want to know the answer, and I'm gonna poll everybody, and I on disc I'm an I, and I want everybody to like me. So this has been a long road for me as well,
Yes.
but you actually talk about how to navigate the turning points based on your intuition. How does that work?
That's actually putting us into chapter 4 because in chapter
Oh,
4 we so it was key that you brought that up because
okay.
that's really the soul identity. When we navigate turning points, we have 2 identities inside of us that are kind of battling it out. And so let me go foremost and answer your question and then go back if that's okay with everybody.
Sure. Do you want me
So
to just
you
pop into chapter 4 stuff,
let's
or
pop into chapter
okay.
4 because you're the book is about how to navigate turning points from the perspective of joy, right? And
Oh,
spiritual,
yeah. Yeah.
because intuition is a big piece of it, very big piece of it. And it's your soul identity. We're all born with such capacity and genius. Unfortunately, we don't tap into it as much because we've been taught society wise to think, oh, our intelligence, we have to overthink things,
Sure, sure, sure.
and we all fall into that trap, and that's the ego trap. Now,
Yeah.
ego's not necessarily a bad thing, guys.
We
Ego
gotta
is our
have some.
self-image. It's our
Yeah.
self-image. So if our self-image is based from fear, like in my case, I was a perfectionist achiever in my first 20 plus years of life, then yeah, it's going to affect you, right? You're going to be self-sabotaging quite a bit for a while. So so you have the ego identity and you have the soul identity. So in answer to your question, the soul identity is the one you want to operate from primarily because this is where God and joy exists. And this is where you get outside, like above the outside noise of our
Mhm.
world, right?
Rise above
And
all the clutter. Yeah.
clutter. And
Yeah.
this is where Eckhart Tolle's like book, The
Sure.
Power of Now, is usually it's based from this identity of not really operating from the ego, the fear-based ego space, right?
Okay.
So in my book, I talk about fear-based ego. So the first thing that happens when we go through a turning point is the actual turning point. So in chapter 4, I take you to France. I take you to France because
Yeah, during the corner.
after I find my fiance cheating, I
Mm.
confront him in chapter 3. I in that moment of trauma and turning point, I get a desire from God to move abroad to France. And he places this desire in my heart. And usually, what happens in a turning point, what I do in the book is I give you my blueprint of how I navigated these turning points in my life. And I tell you what characterizes the turning point. What is your subconscious mind doing at the time?
Mhm.
What's your connection to your higher source, to your intuition? What's going on
Mhm.
with that? What's happening in your environment? How are your feelings in this stage of turning
Mhm.
point? We know that in a turning point, our feelings are raw and real. Like when you catch someone cheating on you, your feelings aren't going to be happy go lucky. They're going to be raw and real. And it depends on who's surrounding you, how you're going to get influenced. And in my case, I was very lucky because it happened towards the end of my spring semester and I ended up going home. So I have my family around me, right? I also have my family who has their own set of limiting beliefs around me. So realize this, okay? So the turning point, the subconscious mind is operating on the programming you currently give of it. So you see
You
the
can see
turning
there's
point
a
cycle of transformation, and
right there
so I
in the
give
book. It's
you
very easy to see, yeah.
the characteristics. So in chapter 4, I kind of like guide you. Okay, here's the turning point, and then I tell you my own application. Okay, my turning point was the loss of engagement to
Mhm.
my, fiance, and I turned to God, and God places this desire in my heart. And desire cycle of transformation is the second cycle that occurs, and it almost occurs within like the same month as the turning point almost. You get the desire placed in your heart almost immediately. And that's why intuition is so important, guys. Turn inward for your answers. Turn to your higher source of power. In my case, it's God. In Andrea's case, it's God. But for other people, it could be various different
Mhm.
sources. They have energy, they have the universe. However, you want to, whatever aligns to your soul, turn to that and ask the question, what is it that I'm meant to do with this turning point? Because it's an opportunity. It's a beautiful opportunity to shift the lens of your life in the direction of your soul.
That's good.
That's
It's an
really
opportunity to shift a lens. I'm all about that. Perspective
yes.
changes,
It's
yeah.
the perspective of it. So when you have this desire, you're going to have this euphoria towards change. You want to change. You have this big push to do it. And just be just realize though that you're still very easily influenced by your circumstances
Yeah.
because
That's hard to step away
you know
from.
it's really difficult, but that first initial step is that desire. And Andrea and I were all both certified by the John Maxwell team, and I remember being on the certification back in Florida and hearing desire is from the Father, meaning from the Father, right? So this is something that comes in that is going to align to what you were, the person you're created to be. So realize this, it's coming from the inside. Um, and then about a month in, you're going to encounter your ego identity. And if it's fear based, it's going to come and smack you in the
Mm,
face because subconscious mind, because it's operating on past programming, when you
yeah.
introduce change to it, it's not gonna like it initially. It's
Yeah.
going to test you.
Sure.
And there's a story in chapter 4 that's hilarious. I've shared it, in a lot of my talks when I talked about sales back when I started my career as a speaker, coach, and trainer. And I'm in France, and it's a month into my welcome, and I'm with my French parents, and they invited all their friends to come and meet me. And, I'm a foreign exchange student. So French, I mean, everything is like gibberish at this stage.
Because you
Everybody's
speak
talking
Spanish,
so
right?
fast.
Because you are of Mexican American heritage, yeah?
Yes. And I
So
speak
you speak
Spanish. That's my
Spanish.
first language. But French is like, gosh, you were like, I thought I knew the French language. No, when you go and you move abroad,
It's fast.
wow, it's really fast. And so they start speaking very fast, and they're in France they sometimes when they do these long drawn out dinners, they do like 6 courses.
Mm,
And so being
sounds
an
fun.
American, I wasn't used to that. And by the fourth course, I was full.
Oh,
And
sure.
so I turned to my French mother and I think I'm telling her, no, thank you, I'm full. Instead, I tell her, no, thank you, I'm pregnant, but not pregnant like a human would be pregnant, but pregnant like a cow would be pregnant. So, so a foreign exchange student, when you make that first language mistake in front of an entire like dinner table of guests that don't know you, yeah, your ego identity is going to come out like swinging, like,
Yeah.
you see, I told you, shut up, don't speak another word, that past program is going to come out.
Yeah.
And so ego identity is where most of us are stuck in
Yeah.
right now. in our lives before we get any kind of coaching or therapy. We don't realize it. We're not aware of this. We're not doing this on purpose to
Sure.
stay stuck in our circumstances, but this is how the ego shows up, and fear-based ego shows up for
Yeah.
us. So I kind of talk about be careful with ego identity. But
Yeah.
the most important cycle of transformation in all of this is really emergence, and that's number four coming up. Emergence is so critical to our development, because if we push past emergence, we get to soul identity
Mm.
in any turning point. And emergence is real. It's kind of tricky, because this is where you start making those changes. Because the very next day from that ego identity crisis I went through, I vowed I was going to, I went back to my desire that God had placed in my heart, and meaning my purpose. Why am I doing this? Why am I here abroad? I was here to become fluent and to study abroad. And so I was going to make this day the most joyful as I possibly could. And so the very next day, I went out and I observed the French, and I started to become them. So it's
Mm.
this becoming
Okay.
part that turning points can help us do. Step into a different role in our life, get better at our relationships, whatever the turning point is for you. But emergent cycle of transformation is really important. So go back to your desire, um, and it's strong, because when you start to gain momentum with these changes and these new habits you're incorporating in life, you start getting results, and it starts to kind of empower you to continue this path.
Right.
But realize that in emergence, it's very easy to fall back into the ego identity trap, because we are working against like years and years of this programming. So
Yeah.
give yourself tons of grace during
And the
emergence
older we
cycle, just like
are,
tons and tons of grace, and reward yourself when you gain these small wins,
yeah.
because that is so important to empower you.
Yeah.
And really, self-love is a very critical piece of it, that we talk a lot about in chapter 4. And when you push past old ego and you get to soul identity, now this is what I call the golden ticket. This is what you really want to
Yeah.
aim for, right?
Yeah.
This is what we all want in life. We want to operate from the space where nothing really triggers us. Like where we actually detach from people's patterns of behavior, realize, don't take it personal.
Yeah. No
I
more
mean,
expectations.
uh,
Just,
just you live your life and you enjoy the pockets of joy that are available for us,
yeah.
even as we're navigating storms in life, because we
Yeah.
all will continuously navigate these storms in life.
Yeah.
So, what is soul identity? Your subconscious mind now accepts this new identity, because we have to create this identity. And it
Hmm.
takes time to create
Hmm.
this new identity, because once again, we've talked about how our confidence can do this yo-yo effect,
Oh boy.
especially when
Sure.
ego comes in and threatens it.
Uh-huh.
But now your confidence is aligned to the vision that you have for your life.
Mm.
Totally, total alignment. What that looks like and how it manifests is when you have family drama that wants to bait you into these
Sure.
situations, you have mechanisms in place that you can
Mm.
just interrupt those thoughts before they become these huge feelings inside of you. Because now feeling is key. The
Well,
feeling piece is very, very key. So,
and you've described this process that I'm going to assume doesn't happen in a 30-day read. Um,
no.
but you've been so matter of fact about it. I'm sitting here going, oh my word, this is gigantic. And for those of us who are coaches, we look at a client who needs to walk through these transitions, and every coach is going to call it a little something different.
Yeah.
But the fear barrier and pushing through certain things, but every coach talks with a client in these ways, and it could take you 60 days for one minimum small one. It could take you 6 years to really do this. And for those of us who are intensely on this journey because we want to help others be on the journey, every day we learn something new and go, oh, last year. And, so I've been certified as a maximal leadership certification coach 3 years now. And
Of
and there's always something new. And
course.
so, Sylvia, the best place to find you and connect with you is on LinkedIn. And this is not a clickable thing, so we're not putting that up there, but you can just search Sylvia Worsham and she will show up, I promise. And you provide services to clients. Do you do one-on-one coaching?
I do one-on-one coaching, I do masterminds, and I'm creating one, Joy in the Journey, with for Journey to Me readers, and I'm gonna be doing it in sections because it's 15 chapters, so it depends on what they're going through, and we need to start foundational with them so they understand, so it's not so overwhelming. So I do masterminds on that, and of course, I do masterminds on John's books because we're both trained to do that, and, I do speaking engagements, and
Hmm.
I'm currently writing chapters for other books to be released later on the summer, so
Yay.
that's an interesting new, role I'm actively, like, truly, truly actively and joyfully moving towards.
Just becoming more solidified as an author.
Yes, yes, because that
Excellent.
was really my sole identity,
Yeah.
and God has been trying to reach me for many years, but my perfectionist, my achiever, kinda kept him at bay.
See, y'all,
But now I'm like, "Okay, I'm joyfully stepping in there, I promise you."
it's not automatic, but, through LinkedIn, they can find out about your masterminds, is that correct?
Yes, they can
Okay,
find out about the masterminds, they can find out about me, they can reach me, they can message me directly, I have it open to anybody for
excellent,
anybody to reach me, so
excellent,
very
excellent.
easy to find me.
Well, for anybody who missed this or came in on the end of it, this will be in my YouTube channel, and I will share, of course, all this with you so that you can share it with your people. It will be for anybody in my Facebook group. It'll be over in the guide section. So that's a benefit of being in Facebook is that it's just there. You don't have to go over to YouTube. But hey, welcome. Come on over to YouTube. There's plenty to learn there, and we will make sure that we share this, including Sylvia's information. Thank you so much, my friend. I'm so glad that we were brought together to meet and to learn about each other and to share and to collaborate in helping other people navigate change.
Been my absolute joy and pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. Until next time.